Today's players wouldn't even have a story if it weren't for history. I've got 5 reasons why you need to have vintage as part of your collection today on Data Dive. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Data Dive powered by Market Movers. My name is Tyler Nethercott, better known as Teapot. Did you see the incredible episode of Slabs this last Sunday on our Sports Card Investor channel with Marshall Fogel's legendary collection? If you haven't watched that yet, you must go check out that video after this one. It's truly mind-blowing. One of the greatest collections in existence, maybe the best ever, and it's all vintage. And that video is what really prompted this one. Today, I want to talk about vintage. This is a topic that almost always seems to come up in the comments on these videos, on our videos over on the Sports Card Investor channel. And what's really interesting is that I see a fair amount of people in the comments saying that you don't use Market Movers because you collect vintage. But did you know that we actually have tens of thousands of vintage cards in Market Movers? The number one focus of my data team for the last 4 months has been building out our vintage database, and it's now bigger than it has ever been. So I want to show up a bit of that today, but in actuality, I really just want to highlight why vintage collecting is amazing and why it should be a part of every collector's pursuits. So without further ado, let's get into those 5 biggest reasons, starting with reason number 1. So reason number 1 is history. And I surveyed a lot of people on Instagram asking, tell me why you love vintage, and the number 1 reason that came back was history. Really? I know many of us didn't necessarily like history in high school. Guys in funny wigs, memorizing dates and places, wars, kind of boring. But as I've gotten a little bit older, I've started to really appreciate what came before me. It's a connection to the past. And as I said, today's leagues, the players that we root for today and what we watch, would not exist and would not have a story today without history. Now, have you ever heard of George Taliaferro? If you haven't, you need to check out his story, see what I did there, over on Victory Investments Instagram page. I've mentioned this account in the past. He does a lot of awesome work, a lot of fun content, but he also does a great job storytelling. And there's this video that he did of George Taliaferro, the first black man drafted into the NFL. So there's kind of this comparison between Jackie Robinson and George Taliaferro, but George Taliaferro's much less well known. So you can come over and watch this awesome video. He also did one on Sugar Ray Robinson, so make sure to check him out. And we actually have this George Taliaferro card in our database. It's his 1948 Leaf rookie card. It's got the yellow back, that's the more common one, although it is anything but a common card, actually really rare. These hardly ever sell and transact, so that's an example of a card that you could go and look out and check out in Market Movers and kind of get lost in the history and the significance of it. Now, another guy who responded, Sports Cards and Sunsets on Instagram, also said it really well. He said he enjoys vintage because it's being a steward of an object that was part of one or more entire lives before his own. It's that sort of butterfly effect that I talk about a lot, the connectedness to the past. Studying history can help us get a better perspective on our present lives by better understanding what came before us. And that is the first reason why you need to collect vintage. All right, reason number 2 that you need to collect vintage is nostalgia. Now this one is the one that really speaks to the heart. It gives us those warm fuzzies, those goosebumps. Maybe you got introduced to sports cards in the first place by a vintage expert. Maybe you just have a fondness for that bygone era. I certainly didn't live through the 40s and the 50s, but that period of rebuilding and national unity in this country is something that has long intrigued me. It's nostalgic even though I never lived through it. Maybe you did live through these eras. Maybe you collected when you were young, and these players, they still really speak to you, even perhaps long after they're gone. Nostalgia is one of the main reasons that all of us collect in general, and vintage and nostalgia certainly go hand in hand. Reason number 3 that you need to collect vintage, vintage is art. It is simple, it's deep, and in many cases, less is more. Vintage cards, they don't refract, they aren't die cut, they aren't see-through or serial numbered. You won't find a big piece of a cleat protruding out of a vintage card. And while those things are all things that I personally love in our modern era, vintage is simpler. And by virtue of its simplicity, in many ways, it is much more profound. The cards are about the athletes. The cards capture emotion, joy, grit, resilience, humility, and they capture that competitive spirit. The colors are rich and saturated and completely profound. I went to the National this year with a limited list of cards that I was looking to add. I was more focused than I've tended to be in the past at card shows, and one of the cards on my wish list was to get my first T206 card. And this Christy Mathewson Dark Cap, it's in an SGC 1, but it's incredible. It's well-centered, it has great registration. That's a term that's used in vintage if you don't know kind of how the colors are printed and layered correctly on the card. The corners and the edges are fairly intact. The only reason that this card got an SGC 1 is that the back of this card has paper loss on it. I took this around to vintage experts and asked them, just looking at the front, what grade they thought this was, and many said somewhere between a 4 and a 6. And this is what makes collecting vintage so much fun. While there might only be 1 or 2 cards in the checklist for a specific player, every copy tells a story and has its pros and its cons. So this is something you hear all about eye appeal when you're reviewing vintage cards, and that's what can make pricing the cards admittedly somewhat challenging. Not all SGC 1s are created equal, not all PSA 7s are created equal. You have to put in the time and the effort to learn, to evaluate, to negotiate, and to see what speaks to you with the card, what's most important in that eye appeal aspect to you. Collecting vintage allows you to curate your own little home museum, and it's art, which is reason number 3 why you need to collect vintage. All right, reason number 4 is that financially it's more stable and reliable. You know what vintage athletes can't do? They can't tear their ACL, they can't get a concussion, they can't enter into contract disputes and holdouts, and the vast majority of these athletes also don't or won't tarnish their legacies and reputations by other off-the-field issues like we unfortunately see happen with so many of today's athletes. Their stories are set in stone, their legacies are established, and many vintage cards just have much more stable pricing over time because of this. There's a slow and steady, wins the race kind of approach, and this keeps the flipping game largely out of the vintage space, leaving the majority of the participants as true collectors who really, really appreciate the cards. Because vintage cards come in so many different grades, often from 1 all the way up to 9 or authentic, there are big price ranges based on your budget. You can get many of the same cards in the low grade for $50 to $100 that you can in the highest grade for tens of thousands or more. As Marshall Fogel put it in that Slabs episode, it doesn't matter. If you like the lower grades and that's what you can afford, that's awesome and enjoy it. All right, and last but not least, reason number 5 is that it's more focused and it's a more refined collecting experience. Many players from vintage eras only have 1 or 2 cards from that year during their playing years, or in many cases far fewer than that. And this makes the chase for what we call runs more enticing. A run is when you kind of get the sequence of cards year over year, like for example, if you wanted to get a copy of every Mickey Mantle Topps card every year, regardless of grade. I've done many videos about how many thousands of different rookie cards modern athletes have and how many hundreds of one-of-ones they have. You won't get that in vintage. There's only one 1957 Topps Mickey Mantle card, that's it. Sometimes you get cards with different backs or different colors, and that can provide a lot of fun because it's a different kind of chase. But you won't have to figure out if a blue Flash Hoops numbered to 49 is better or worse than a pink Laser Donruss numbered to 50. So like with today's products, in the vintage collecting space, there are player collectors, there's team collectors, but the set collector is also very much alive and well in vintage, and that's yet another way that you can get into the game. So no matter what your collecting identity is, vintage is going to provide you a focused and refined way for you to plug in, and that's reason number 5 why you need to collect vintage. Now, before I wrap up, a few warnings with respect to vintage. Number 1 is be careful of fakes and altered cards. Ryan over at Breakout Cards has a great book that you can pick up on Amazon called Spotting Fakes, or you can simply buy authenticated and graded copies of the cards already if you're not so sure and you're not an expert. Or as another option, you can find a good and reputable dealer who can be trusted if you're interested in adding raw copies to your collection. And the other warning that I alluded to before is that the prices are just not consistent from one card to the next in the same grade. Don't beat up a dealer about comps at shows. A lot of vintage dealers, they don't care as much about comps. Enjoy the dance. Many dealers have had these cards for a long time, and they're perfectly fine waiting until they get their asking price, and that's okay. I recommend talking to them, learn, engage, build a relationship, and ask them how they amass their collections, and hopefully you'll come home with a card or 20 in your own PC to enrich your collecting experience. So, are you convinced? What are you waiting for? Go start exploring and let the cards speak to you. And as I said earlier, Market Movers has tons and tons of vintage cards from all sports and eras. Let me show you what that looks like briefly. You want pre-war cards. I'm over here on the price movements page in this gallery view. You want pre-war. Look at all these pre-war cards. 105 pages of pre-war cards. These are just the ones that have transacted in the last 90 days. Same thing here. This is, you want the 40s and the 50s. That post-war era, we've got that. Same thing with the 60s and 70s. And you can come in here and just sort of take it in. Let the cards speak to you. See which ones stand out. Stare at them like you would a piece of art in a museum and see what really calls and speaks to you. And you start to unpack the complexity of these very, very simple designs from back then. And in many cases, we have the entire checklists loaded for these products. I added in the entire T205 set, the 1915 Cracker Jack, all of it. We've added in a lot of these entire checklists so that if you're a set builder, you can track that too. So if you want to get into this data, visit marketmoversapp.com and use promo code DIVE to get your first 7 days free. And as always, if you like this video, click that little thumbs up, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. Until next time, happy investing, keep on collecting, and make sure you're having fun.